So why do we think a global sector approach is required? Well, as you've already heard this morning, over 40% of all steel is traded internationally, one of the most internationally traded commodities. Steel crosses international borders all the time. Secondly, the current best practice is mainly in the Kyoto countries. A little bit of caution here, there are steel plants in the developing countries and the non-Kyoto countries which are outstanding in terms of their CO2 performance. It's not a simple case of that, but in general you can say that the best performance is in Kyoto countries. Those are countries that signed the Kyoto Protocol, not the ones that finally ratified it. In other words, I include the United States in what I call Kyoto countries in that respect. Today, because of the growing importance of China, I estimate that China already accounts for over 50% of all the direct emissions associated with the production of steel in the world. My Chinese colleagues say, no, you're slightly overestimating it. But China produces 50% of all the iron produced in the world, and most of the CO2 emissions we make are associated with iron. So I'm reasonably confident that number is not too far out. And as I said before, the greatest scope for improvement in the short and the medium term is in countries such as China, India, Russia, and lastly, for instance, Ukraine as well. Next slide, please. So what is our global sector approach? It's very simple. First of all, we are getting everybody to measure and report their emissions. And then based on that common definition and standard reporting around the world, we are asking steelmakers all around the world to set targets for improvement in the CO2 emissions associated with every ton of steel they make. And lastly, we're saying it's absolutely essential if we're going to address a global problem that all the major steel producers and countries must be engaged in this process. And that last point is why we have such a strong focus on the second point, because you cannot realistically expect countries like India and China to accept a situation where they're asked to put an absolute cap on their CO2 emissions. These are growing. There are issues of poverty and economic development and social development. The steel industry will grow in these countries. So the focus we have for them is for every ton of steel you make, you must address the efficiency issue. They accept that, and that is why this is a consensus position within our industry. Next slide, please. So briefly, what are we doing today? Today we are doing three main things. We're starting the process of data collection. And some 2 months ago, following our board meeting in St. Petersburg, we rolled out a program where we want, first of all, every ISI member company to measure and report its CO2 emissions. But then we're saying that we want to go even beyond the membership of our industry, because we only account for 75% of total production. And some of the smaller and less efficient producers are outside our membership as part of that process. That will take time. We had some good progress reports on Wednesday. Our data collection group is meeting here in Washington. Already over half ISI members have signed up to this process. It's a secure, financial services-based website to keep the confidentiality of the data and so on. But that process is rolling out. It will take a year or two, frankly, but it's a very important foundation stone for the commitments that we expect to be made going forward. The second work we're doing in parallel is we're doing some projections of what the world is likely to look in the year 2050. The scientists in the international panel are doing that. Governments are addressing the dilemma of that period. So we believe as an industry, we have to be able to say to governments what we think the development of our industry is going to be in terms of our demand, our production, and our CO2 efficiency, even over that long time scale. So if we're going to have a constructive dialogue with governments, we need to be in the position to do that. Some other people, like the International Energy Agency, have done some work on that, but we think at the end of the day, we're probably the best qualified to actually say what's likely to happen in our own industry. And we've already started a dialogue with governments and international agencies around the world about what our approach is. Welcome. The responsibilities are divided between us. Obviously, it's not my job to directly talk to the American administration or you. I'm delighted to be here today, but that responsibility lies with the American steel industry. And around the world, it's a dialogue between the steel industry in their own country with their own governments is the focal point of this. My job is to make sure there are similar messages and similar approach being adopted around the world, and to also brief international agencies, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the International Energy Agency, and so on. And I think even this morning you will realize that I think what's impressive about our approach is there is a consistency of view around the world, and there is a common commitment which is shared amongst the steel industry to do that. That the real problem which we think needs to be addressed is global CO2 emissions, and in the long term. And we are concerned that everybody is focused on achieving that and is not focused on things in the short term, which paradoxically may make the problem worse.